Good afternoon and welcome to Chapter 1. In these series of videos that I will be creating, I'm always working on making them more engaging and quicker. Our attention span is getting smaller and smaller due to media getting interesting and more interesting, and there's just so much that our attention span is just lower. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly. If you have further questions, obviously let me know. And of course, the book is there for you, but I'm going to see if I can hit the highlights here on these slides. So I've got 23 of them, so let's get started. So the learning objectives of this chapter is that we are going to talk about social welfare, its goals, the relationship between social welfare and then social work, psychology, sociology, human services, and then a little bit about the differences between those as well. Social work, welfare history, we'll hit a little bit, but I find that I kind of lose people, and most people are like, what's the difference? So it actually does make a difference, but we'll go over that kind of briefly, and then we're gonna have a crystal ball, and we're gonna look into the future and find out what that entails as well. So, all right, describe social welfare and its goals. So, social welfare, its goal is to fulfill social. Social is like me with you, like maybe I'm working, or maybe we're out at the same park at the same time, or maybe we're on a date. That's what social is, like a social goal. Like humans do well when they're in contact with other people. That's really, really important, right? Isolation is not healthy for us, right? Maybe some of us need more socialization, but we all need some. All right. Financial, health, and recreational requirements for all society, all individuals in a society. So it's a pretty big goal, but basically it's like this. If you were the king of the country, and you're like, okay, how do I make life for my people to be good? You're talking about social welfare. You're like, how do I get them to get along with each other? How do I make sure that people have enough money so that they can buy food and shelter and, a little bit for savings? How do I make sure they're healthy? How do I make sure that they are not just sitting around on the couch all day, but that they're playing tennis, or that they're going for a walk, that they're bird watching, that they're doing hobbies? And you're talking about social welfare, right? You want to make sure all the people in your society are thriving, and that's what social welfare is about. So, all right. As an institution, okay, so this is this is like the nation, as a nation, if you're king, or I guess if you want to talk about the United States and the government, right? We've created programs, right? And benefits and services to help people do those things we just talked about. Everything from, we have a Department of Transportation, right? And why do we spend all these, billions of dollars on roads and bridges? Because we feel like it adds to people's social welfare, specifically their financial welfare. Okay, and so that's an institution. The Department of Transportation, the Department of Correction, the Department of Social Services. These are all institutions that we have created as a nation. Okay, an institution is just a fancy name for a large group of, it's an organization with a large number of people who are all kind of working toward the same thing, right? So if we were to say, like, what is marriage as an institution, or the institution of marriage? It's just like all of the marriages in the nation, and like what are they doing? How do you become married? What are benefits and problems that exist within the institution of marriage, not the individual, basically. So, all right, well, what about as a discipline? Social welfare refers to a wide range of activities and services by volunteers, nonprofit organizations, and governmental agencies providing help to needy persons unable to care for themselves. Activities and resources designed to enhance or promote the well-being of the individuals, families, and larger societies, and efforts to eliminate or reduce incidences of social problems. All right. The NASW, which stands for the National Association of Social Work. It's a professional organization that governs parts of what social work does. It's not really part of the government, but the government kind of works hand in hand with it, kind of like in Red Cross. Red Cross is not part of the government, but it works with the government. And the goals of social work. Social workers should promote the general welfare of society. Like society should be better off because of social workers. And if they're not, then it's like, okay, then we're not doing this core thing. We're missing something that's really, really important, right? Because society should be better off because of social workers, right? From local to global levels, the development of people, their communities, and their environments. One of the things that I always kind of forget is that when I think of social work, I think of the individual or I think of the group, but social work is supposed to be on a big scale as well. So for instance, if there are laws that are not working well for people, social workers should be advocating for the changing of those laws. Social workers should advocate for living conditions conducive, which means that help to the fulfillment of basic human needs and should promote social, economic, political, and cultural values and institutions that are compatible with the realization of social justice. Okay, so what does that actually mean? To advocate for living conditions conducive to the fulfillment of human basic needs, right? And so if you were to drive into certain neighborhoods, maybe like in the Appalachia part of the United States or in inner cities or even in some of our rural communities, there are living conditions that are just not conducive for the fulfillment of basic needs. Why? Because there's not a grocery store within 30 miles that will sell you a fresh cabbage, for instance. And the social workers can say, hey, what can we do to make living conditions better so that people are more likely to live fulfilling lives, so that their basic needs are met, right? Realization of social justice so that everybody has an equal shot at being successful, right? That's like that when everybody, I mean, maybe you go to court or you go to a job, you're going to be graded not based upon where you came from or who your parents are, color of your skin, your gender, things like that, but like, hey, can I do this, right? That's the realization of social justice, in my own words. Describe the relationship between social welfare and the following disciplines: sociology, psychology, social work, and human services. So they're all kind of related in a sense. Social welfare, again, this is what a society says we want to create an environment where people can live fulfilling lives. Well, politics has something to say about that, right? Politicians are always promising, hey, vote for me and I will make your life better, right? Economics, right? If we allow people, if we make jobs and money and interest rates, that impacts people's social welfare, right? Psychology is, the study of the mind. Sociology, the study of the group. Psychiatry is a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who studied, uh, who's done his residency. So like right after med school, you go to, you study at a certain place in a mental health hospital, I think. And so oftentimes what psychiatrists do is that they will see people who are suffering from usually pretty significant mental health disorders, because if you have mild depression or mild anxiety, the likelihood is you're going to see your general practitioner, and usually psychiatrists get the more severe cases, but not always, but that's generally kind of the way I think about that. Cultural anthropology has to do with culture, and it's usually focused on like indigenous peoples or people that have, like living in tribal type of areas. But it's, there's even a place for it in like mainstream United States, focused on things like why is it that we spend so much time in the kitchen, but then when we want an upgrade to our house, we tend to like build like extra bathrooms on the master bedroom and things like that. So it's just trying to understand like on a very like basic level, how we get along and interact with our people. So all these things kind of contribute to this. They're just going to come at it from a little bit of a different perspective. Social welfare's relationship to social work, right? So social welfare is bigger than social work. I mean, I hope I made that point already. I mean, social work isn't, working on the roads. They're not working on changing interest rates, or maybe a little bit, but then they're not really setting those, right? Social welfare is so much bigger than what social work does, right? But everything that social work does should be inside social welfare, because it should be that like everything we're doing is for the betterment of society, whether on an individual level or on a societal level. So social welfare and social work are primarily related at the level of practice, right? So social workers can work on an individual level. That's what I tend to think of, but that doesn't mean you can't work out at the government, for the government, with politicians, helping to point out, hey, if we make these changes, this is how these usually vulnerable people will be impacted, right? New York City is a good example of this. New York City decided to build, I think it's the Brooklyn Bridge, which cut off a significant portion of Brooklyn, and it isolated it, and it created a lot of poverty. Wouldn't it be cool if we had thought of that beforehand, or considered it, and we could have said, okay, if we still want to build this bridge, what are we going to do to make sure that the people over here still thrive, that their social welfare is still considered? Uh, all right. And there's more than just the ones we mentioned. There's also nurses and attorneys and recreational therapists and teachers and urban planners. All right. Social welfare's relationship to other institutions. It's going to overlap into the family, right? We think about the family as like our core institution, where or at least vast majority of us are born into a family, and they're teaching us right from wrong and the language and how to eat, how to treat people, and then the education system, right? And all these things are included in the social welfare like bracket, like if our families are struggling, our social welfare is definitely going to be impacted. But if our education is doing amazing, that's going to also impact our social welfare. So our religious institutions, right? Our politics, all these things overlap with one another, right? And oftentimes one follows the next. Like if the families are doing well, oftentimes education is also impacted for positive, religion is impacted, and it has a trickle, or whatever effect of continuing the positive cycle. All right, let's talk about human services. Human services, services that are focused on humans as opposed to roads or the environment or things like that. May be defined as those service systems of services and allied occupations. I'm going to learn to read here in a minute. Allied occupations, that means occupations that are in connection with those services. And professionals that concentrate on improving or maintaining the physical and mental health and general well-being of individuals, groups, communities, and in our society, right? And so in this class, we do a volunteer, and I ask people that they volunteer 10 hours at a human services organization or a social services organization. Those are oftentimes used interchangeably, right? And so what are those agencies going to be about? Physical, mental health, and general well-being of the individuals, groups, communities in our society. So human services is a broad term because it's going to include library services, law enforcement, right? Housing, fire protection, right? But we don't oftentimes consider those social welfare services, but in a sense, everything's kind of connected together, but social work tries to like focus more on the mental, physical, general well-being. All right, a little bit about the history of social work, just to kind of know where we're coming from. And here's why. The ways we think about social work today come from the past. And what we have today is here because of something that happened in the past. And so, for instance, the United States tends to be stingy when it comes to social services for the people, and that's because of our past, like beliefs that we've had in the past, religious beliefs, books that were written, politicians that were popular 200 years ago, and they sowed an idea that took hold. And so that's why among rich countries, we tend to be on the stingier side of things. Now, certainly there are other countries that are much poorer than us that have less, but anyway, the reason why we do what we do, the reason, for instance, why we're so afraid of the poor taking advantage of us is because we've got some ideas about private property, and we have got like a history of believing these things. And so whether they're right or wrong, there's a history to this. All right, let's talk about residual versus institutional view of social welfare. I don't know why they want to use these fancy terms. They feel like there's some easier terms that would be clearer for people. But a residual view of social welfare is a view that the group or the government, the church, the town, the group should only step in when they're absolutely needed. That the responsibility for the individual's life is on the individual, and that the structure shouldn't really have to change because people are primarily responsible for themselves. I'm not quite saying this right. It's that when something goes wrong, the primary responsibility is for the person who is the victim, or the person, if I'm poor, then the residual view would say it's primarily your issue. It's basically what that would be, right? And the institutional view of social welfare would say, if I'm poor, then what's going on with the environment? Like, what's going on with the job world? What's going on with the educational world? What's going on with the transportation, mental health, things like that. And so it's not so much saying that it's like that institutional view will never put fault on the individual, or that the residual view will always put fault on the individual, but it's saying like their first gut response, or what they advocate resources, you know? And so the institutional view is going to say, okay, well, what is the group doing to help out the individual? And so it lacks stigma, because it's like the first thought is, well, it's not the individual because they want to do it, right? Whereas the residual view says, actually, the individual probably doesn't want to do it. They're probably doing something wrong. They're lazy, or they're not working hard enough, or they've got some sort of mental health issue or IQ problem. Therefore, there's something going on with them. So the residual view will help, but it just oftentimes it's reluctant to. All right, liberalism versus conservatism. This is just a political ideology, and you might be saying, well, what does politics have to do with it? Well, quite a bit, actually, because politics decides about how resources are spent, or group resources are spent. So like, do we fund schooling, or do we fund police officers? Do we give tax cuts, or do we, put more, I don't know, better water systems for people? Like, it actually really matters. And so on the far side, if you were to say, like, where's small government? Well, smallest government is libertarian, which I guess is not here. It's part of the other party. So libertarians are like very, very small government, maximum amount of freedom. Smaller government, maybe over here somewhere, would be conservatives. Bigger government is liberals, right? And then, the extremely big government would be like, I don't know, socialism, things like that. So it's just a view of like, what is the proper place for government? Should the government, I don't know, like force companies to pay people when they have a baby, 50% of their salary? Well, liberals are going to say yes, that's their job. Conservatives are going to say no. If people want that, then they'll choose to work at companies that offer that as a benefit, something like that. Or like, pornography. Like liberals are going to say that that's free speech and the individual gets to decide. Conservatives are going to say, no, we need to protect people from material that is going to create harm and pull people away from traditional, sexuality, things like that. The developmental view of social welfare. The process of planned social work change designed to promote the well-being of the population as a whole in conjunction with dynamic process of social development. Okay, um, we mentioned the residual view and we mentioned the institutional view. The developmental view is kind of a combination of those. It says, well, what if we just funded the things that were good for making money? Like education is a great way, or street, funding your highway, your streets. That it would be an example of something that developmental view of social work would be all on board for. The institutional view of social work would be like, hey, we need to make sure that our seniors are taken care of. The residual view would say, no, it wouldn't. But the developmental view would say, no, it wouldn't either. Why? Because it's not really about economic development. They're all for helping little kids because they're going to be your future workers, but your elderly people are not. And so just kind of like a perspective. History of social work. The early Europeans, which is kind of where we get America is basically like in our religion, in our language, in our culture, in our economics, we are a product of England. We speak English. We just do a lot of things in a very English style. And so that's why they trace back to, say, the early European history rather than Asian or Latin America and something like that. So early European history would have looked to the church and looked to the wealthy people to care for the poor. After the Industrial Revolution, no, after the fall of feudalism and the church loses power and the feudal lords fall and no longer have as much power, in England, Queen Elizabeth creates an Elizabethan poor law, and in this law, it was the 1600s, she says that there are deserving poor people and then there are non-deserving poor people, and kind of really distinguishes between that. And I think that's interesting because today we still struggle with that. Like we're still like, well, did they deserve it or they did not deserve it, right? Well, maybe that's where that came from because it was there in law. And if you were not deserving, you had to get a job or you were going to be like thrown in prison. And if you were deserving, it wasn't like you got to live in the, in anywhere nice. You just got to like live in these like poor houses where they would, bring you food and stuff on a daily basis. If you were young, then they would want to like put you to work or find you an internship or somebody, not internship, like an apprenticeship, or somebody that would teach you a trade for that. The Industrial Revolution comes along in the 1700s in Europe and then the 1800s in the United States and just radically changes society. I'm of the opinion we really haven't recovered from the Industrial Revolution, and we're getting ready to enter into another revolution, called the AI revolution, maybe. And so what this does is it causes people to leave the family farms and go work in the factories. And so families have way less children because of this. Dad and mom are now living in separate spheres. Dad has a lot more power. The family becomes much more optional. We become much more urbanized, and just a lot of changes occur in Europe and then in the United States. Turn of the 20th century, and so that's the century we're in now. You see kind of a combination of, I don't know, we've been doing social welfare in the government for so long that people are expecting it, even if they kind of resent it. So, for instance, we have all these programs that we've created: Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, Workman's Comp, and so we kind of dislike the fact that the government does them, but we also are kind of used to it, and so it's weird because people will show up to rallies like who want to like shrink the government, but they're on like oxygen tanks that come and are paid for by the government. And it's like we don't really quite understand, I think, that the government does all these things for us that we kind of take them for granted. We don't really understand that we're kind of chopping off the tree limb that we're standing on, or at least that's my spin on this. Things changed quite a bit in the Great Depression, and here's why they changed. The Great Depression was such a big problem that, at the peak, a third of us were out of work, and the idea that we were all responsible for our own welfare kind of went away because lots of good, hardworking people lost their jobs, not due to any fault of their own, but because of bankers and real estate investors that just got really carried away and took the whole economy down with them because they were way over leveraged. And so coming out of the Great Depression, we passed all these new social welfare policies like Social Security, disability, and all these, we put people to work building our parks and our dams and things to try to get the economy going. And the government greatly expands under during the Great Depression as a way of kind of spending our way out of it. And it's hard to shrink the government. It's easy to grow it. It's hard to shrink it because it looks like you're firing people and laying people off, and that it gets ugly. President Johnson declares war on poverty because poverty was not equally distributed. You had a lot of people of color, you had a lot of people in certain areas of the country that were still poor, and tries to, spend money on government programs, education, welfare programs, as a way of trying to balance those inequalities out. Ultimately is not successful. And by the 1970s, we kind of give up and say we're ready to stop spending money, and we elect President Reagan, who greatly slashes the government welfare programs. All right, the future of social welfare in the United States in under Barack Obama, I think it was 2010, 2012, we passed the Affordable Care Act, which is sometimes referred to as Obamacare. It's the same thing. And it says that everybody has to have health insurance because that is tied to much better outcomes health-wise. And we don't like it. It went back to Congress and the Supreme Court multiple times. But I think it's one of those things where after we get used to it, we kind of make peace with it. So, by the way, the Affordable Care Act was kind of a combination between what liberals and conservatives want. It tried to marry the free market, which is what conservatives like, competition among healthcare providers, with some government assistance, which is what liberals wanted. And in a sense, nobody kind of got what they wanted, really. The liberals would really prefer nationalized healthcare, which is where the government provides healthcare for everybody, or at least health insurance, which a lot of European countries do. And conservatives would really prefer that the government stay out of healthcare. And so the Affordable Care Act is kind of this conglomeration of those two things today. Where do we stand today? We have a lot of issues, and probably one of the biggest one is inequality. We have greater wealth inequality than we've had in a really, really long time, and that's causing a lot of resentment. Technology has been great for a few people who have access to it, and for a lot of us who don't. During the pandemic, you saw a lot here. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of social unrest around things like race and sexuality, gender identity, and so a lot more people are more vocal about those sort of things. Technology changes has really impacted a lot of things due to the, really we're all now journalists on one social media platform or another. We have environmental changes where we have more fires and floods than we've had in the past. And then every new presidential administration, typically the president will come in and undo a significant amount of what the previous president did, which is kind of just bad practice because you just kind of like keep undoing what we created, and that makes it kind of difficult for the local social service agencies to kind of know what's coming and plan their budgets around those sort of things. So this is way longer than I thought it would be, but I'll work on it next time, making it shorter. Thank you for watching.